The research, what are the broader impacts of child abuse? Research clearly indicates that children who've been abused or neglected often have poorer outcomes on many indicators of health and well-being, including social, emotional, physical and psychological functioning. So there's a strong link between experiences of childhood abuse and higher rates of problems in later life, such as depression, anxiety, homelessness, relationship breakdowns, criminal behaviour and substance abuse. So what can you do? Firstly, you can apply DFAT's child protection policy and ensure that your organisation is applying the 9 minimum standards within that. You can assess and manage risk, so you can assess the risk of all of your activities and manage that risk. Check your partners are safeguarding children. If you receive DFAT funding, then your organisation's child protection policy must apply to all personnel, partners and subcontractors who are engaged to perform any part of a DFAT funded activity. So it's important that you're also ensuring that they're safeguarding children. And report concerns, any concerns you have. And in addition to that, also behave appropriately is very important too. Does anyone have any questions regarding why children need care and protection? Great, okay, we'll carry on then. So, an overview of DFAT's child protection policy. So we've been working towards a whole of DFAT approach to child protection, and DFAT recently released a refreshed child protection policy in January, along with a suite of guidance materials for our staff and our partners as well. So where the previous policy was for the Australian Aid program, this refreshed policy applies to all of DFAT now, so it covers all DFAT activities. Development remains a focus as it has the greatest risk regarding child protection. So what this means now is that the child protection policy that we have in place now requires an assessment of child protection risk for each activity. And if there's contact or working with children is identified, then a full child protection risk assessment needs to be undertaken to determine whether or not the organisation has to implement a child protection policy and all the 9 minimum standards as well. So it's organisations funded by DFAT only need to implement a child protection policy where there's impacts to children, where impacts to children are identified. So, for example, research firms using third-party information wouldn't necessarily need a child protection policy. So it's more of a risk-based policy. Here is our scope. So all DFAT funded partners are within the scope, and that includes volunteers, consultants, and board members and any downstream partners as well, as we discussed. Out of scope are partner country governments because there are sovereignty issues regarding partner governments, and a more effective approach for us is to incorporate dialogue and opportunities to support improved governance in those areas such as health and education. Multilaterals are principle-based. They have to act in accordance with the principles of our policy, and they also need to abide by their own policies and conventions. DFAT staff also are principle-based because now what's happened now that it's across the whole of DFAT, the obligations for DFAT staff are incorporated into our conduct and ethics manual and other consular handbooks and overseas manuals and things like that. So it's all incorporated into there. You've got a glossary in the back of the child protection policy, which will go through all of the definitions that are within our policy. Just child, for example, within our policy is anyone under the age of 18. So we use the highest standard and the UNHCR definition of a child. I'm not going to go into the others because we will do a short exercise regarding contact and working with children in a moment. So that's a quick overview of the policy. Any questions about that? I've got a question here. Okay, so the question is, what about where a local government body, example, the local water agency, is the local partner? Does this not mean the policy does not apply to them? So if you're providing a grant, for example, to a government partner, then we can't. It's difficult for us to then say to a partner government, a ministry, for example, that they must put in place a child protection policy. But we can ask as part of the grant that they have child protection mitigation measures in place. So it might be that you ask that anyone who's part of that activity needs to have a code of conduct, sign a code of conduct, that they must also be recruited safely. And if possible, and if it's something that at the local level they're happy to have some sort of policy in place, and that's great, but it's not something that we can enforce. Anne's asking, what does principle-based approach mean? So it means that it's a bit like a handshake approach. It's a bit like they're making an agreement, and that their policies and that their activities that they run, that they're going to do everything that they can to be child safe. So they don't have to apply to our they don't have to comply with our policy to the letter, but we do check to make sure that they have safeguards in place, that they might have other safeguard policies, for example, social safeguard policies that might not tick every single box within our policy, but the principles are similar. They have the same, it's the sort of same idea regarding our policy, but that doesn't have to be compliant to the letter. Does that help? The reason being is because, for example, the World Bank or UNICEF, they go across their world, across the world, for example, and we can't say you must comply with specifically with our Australian policy when they're also working in the United States and they're also working in the EU and places like that. So it's tricky for us to ask. We can't ask them to comply completely with our policy. But what does happen is, for example, World Bank Pacific, we've been in talks with them, so they're actually building in their own sort of lower level policies that comply with our policies, and same with WHO in the Pacific. So it's like and even UNICEF, say in Fiji, they can't change UNICEF's policies, but they can put processes and procedures in place at the country level. So that's what we try and work with them to do. Great. Now I've got another question saying, we use builders for part of our projects through a local company with casual workers. Do we need to ensure each casual worker is across the policy? If you're using DFAT funds, then yes, you need to make sure that you'll need to make sure that they, for example, at least have signed a code of conduct and understand the behaviours that you expect of them. And depending on and a lot of it depends on the level of risk, for example. It may be that for example, with this sort of project, you may assess it as a contact with children activity where they may have some contact with children. And therefore, you may decide that to manage that risk, a code of conduct is sufficient, and maybe a background check on them, or even just and letting them know about your reporting processes so that they're really aware of how they should report if they do see an issue or a concern, if they have a concern. And I can provide, if you have specific questions regarding that, then you can send them to my our mailbox, and we can answer those questions. Those specific questions that you have. Okay, any more questions? Okay. So we'll look now at your responsibilities. We're going to look at 5 areas, and we'll touch on them. We'll look at risk management, because under the policy you have a responsibility to manage risk. We'll just have a brief look at the minimum standards, and we'll do some a quick exercises. I'll talk through the exercises. We'll look at behaviour, reporting, and use of imaging. So risk management. Okay, so our current policy now provides a risk-based approach to management of child protection in DFAT business. So this is given effect by asking the question in the first instance is, does the program, activity or grant involve potential contact or working with children. If the answer is yes to the first question, then you must do an assessment of child protection risk. An assessment must be conducted. We have a guidance note, which is called, and I've sent you guys all a copy of that, called Establishing Child Protection Risk Context. We'll do an activity with that shortly, but that can help you determine whether an activity is contact or working with children. So it's a really useful activity. It's also something that that I know our audit team, if you're being audited, for example, they love to see that you've used this guidance note as to assess your level of risk for your level of contact for each of your activities. And they definitely do that for our staff anyway, and so I think they would with partners as well. So if it's working with children, so if you do your assessment and it's working with children, then you must do a full child protection risk assessment. Child protection, our section and Save the Children have developed 11 risk guidance notes to help staff to assess the risks within certain activities. We've got ones on violence against women programs, health programs, education programs, and you can use them to help you determine what some of the risks might be in the activities or programs that you're running. If it's a working with children activity, then you must apply all the minimum child protection standards within DFAT policy. And they're in attachment A of DFAT policy. There's 9 of them. If it's contact with children, then again you must assess the child protection risk, and you must apply the appropriate minimum standards to manage that risk. So it may be in some instances you don't need to apply all 9, but it depends on the risk within your activity. We encourage all of our partners to have all 9 because that's really the minimum standards to have a safe organisation, a child safe organisation. And we also say if it's a development organisation, then really it's much higher risk. So you really should have the 9 in place as well. If it's nil contact, then DFAT minimum standards don't apply. I just wanted to put in here about ANCP, which stands for Australian NGO Cooperation Programs. The section within DFAT has actually made a program decision that all managing contractors must have a compliant child protection policy which implements all the 9 minimum standards. That's regardless of whether or not your activity is a working with children activity, contact with children or nil. If you're ANCP accredited, you must have all 9 minimum standards. Here's a picture of the risk management cycle and the tools that DFAT has to assist you. They might be, I don't know if they're tricky to see there. The first is you assess the level of context. Okay, so the level of contact with children, and you can do that using the Establishing Child Protection Risk Context. That guidance note can also help you assess your partner system. So if you're about to engage a downstream partner, you can use the risk guidance note there to help assess whether they're a safe organisation as well. And that helps you determine what the overall risk context is. Then you can we've got a whole 11 child protection guidance notes that you can use to help you undertake the full child protection risk assessment and help you identify and mitigate any risks. There's also a guidance note on monitoring and evaluation. So you can use those for those. The first 3 you can use the Establishing Child Protection Risk Context. The last 3 you can use the guidance notes to help you out. And these are a list of all the guidance notes and where you can find them. So there's some really useful ones there. The recruitment and screening one is really great for if you want. They've got some great questions in there regarding suggested referee questions, suggested behavioural-based questions, and also ways of actually recruiting safely and what you can put in your advertisements and things like that. So it's really a helpful general guidance note as well. Okay, so we're going to do a quick activity. I want you to have a look at take out the Establishing Child Protection Risk Context Guidance Note that you've all been provided a copy with. I recommend you have a good read of this after the session, because it's a really useful document. The first couple of times you do it, it might take a little bit of time to get used to it, but it's a really useful document to sort of have a look at your downstream partners, have a look at your activities and things like that. And it basically helps you establish the child protection risk context of any of your activities and any of your partners as well. So what I want you to do is actually have a look at Part A, or Step 1, sorry, I should say, Step 1, Part A of the guidance note, which is on page 4. If you have a look at that, and it's got a list of questions. And it's quite simple to use. You answer all the questions that are within here. If you've answered yes, or if you answer no to all of them, for example, it means that it would mean that your activity would have nil contact with children, and you wouldn't need to implement DFAT 9 minimum standards for that activity. If you put any yeses in the first section, which says contact with children, but you've got no's everywhere else, then it would be considered a contact with children activity. But if you put a yes in anything under working with children assessment, the number 2 there, then it's likely that your activity would be considered a working with children activity. Or that it's likely that your activity has greater risks for children. You need to manage those risks. So if you just want to spend a couple of minutes, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but just have a couple of minutes having a look at the questions, looking at this activity and having a look at the questions and having a think about what you would answer yes or no to. Don't spend a long time on each one, just have a quick look and see what you think, whether it would be contact or working with children. There's no necessarily right or wrong answer, because people do come up with different answers. So just I'll give you 2 minutes to have a look at that. Okay, did people get a chance to have a look at most of those questions? Did anyone come up with an answer that they want to write down that they came up with, of what the level of contact, what they thought the level of contact might be? I did this activity yesterday, for example, in some training with our staff, and a couple of people came back with moderate, yep, contact with children, but 1 or 2 people sometimes come back with working with children, because they may have ticked, for example, that there may be some vulnerability of the parents, for example. So we don't have a lot of information here, but normally we'd come back with contact with children, and most people are coming back saying it's probably a contact with children activity, because people aren't working directly with children, and they're not working one-on-one with children, for example, but they may have contact with children. And also they're going to be working in remote or rural locations as well. So when people are working in remote or rural locations, or we're introducing somebody into a country, so we're introducing an Australian into some other country, we're introducing a risk into that country or into that community as well. So we need to manage that risk. And it may be that it doesn't necessarily mean that they need to have in place all 9 minimum standards, but we need to manage that risk in some way. People need to know what behaviour, their expectations about our expectations of their behaviour. They need to know how they report if they do see something happening that they've got concerns about. And we need to know that they're safe as well. So we need to ensure that we've recruited them safely and that we've done criminal record checks and referee checks as well. Okay, so once we know that it's a contact with children position or a working with children position, then we need to do a risk assessment and assess what the risks are. If it's a working with children activity, then we really need to we need to spend a little bit more time on the risk assessment, and maybe do it with a few people, or get someone who knows a bit more about child protection to help out with it. We need to make sure that everyone needs to make sure that we're trying to address as many of the child protection risks as possible. To do a risk assessment, you should be using your organisation's risk documentation that you probably already have. If you don't, then you can talk to us. And you need to ask what could go wrong, what risks might exist for children, and what's the likelihood of something going wrong, and what would happen, what would the consequences be. And then you need to manage it. So identify ways of reducing these risks and having procedures in place for when things go wrong. And constantly monitoring those risks, because risks can change over time. So it's really important that we monitor them regularly as well. And also if you include child protection for example, in your regular meetings or your regular staff meetings, for example, it's a good way of sort of constantly monitoring if people are seeing any specific child protection risks coming up within their programs, and they know that they've always got a place to talk about it. If it's something that's always on your meeting agendas and things like that, are ways of trying to always monitor those risks as well. The two main types of risks for children that need to be considered during an activity or investment risk assessment. So they're risks to children by personnel during implementation of an activity, and risk of harm to children through the design or the implementation of an activity. So risks to personnel, assessing the risk to personnel can be undertaken using the risk context tool that we were just looking at, because you can have a look at whether or not the organisation has good systems in place, because the first half of that context tool looks at assessing the level of contact with children, but the second half of that context tool looks at assessing the level of risk of the organisation. So that's a really useful document in that way. And you can also use the guidance notes for both of those types of risks as well. So I've let's do another quick activity as well. I've sent to you also the Violence Against Women program guidance note, and it's one of the guidance notes put together by Save the Children. What I'd like you to do is, I'd like you to spend, again, not very long, maybe spend sort of a few minutes, 5 minutes perhaps, having a look at attachment A of DFAT's child protection policy, because that's looking at the 9 compliance standards, and they're all mitigation measures. And then also have a quick look at the Violence Against Women program guidance note. It's quite long, so you're not going to be able to read it all, but just have a quick look at the way it's formatted, the way it's set out. And then have a look at this scenario and just have a think about, maybe just jot down 1 or 2 risks that you can think about that you could see within this program, and a couple of ways that you can manage it. So maybe we have time for just jotting down 1 risk, and just one or two ways that you could perhaps manage that. I'm going to give you, I reckon, about 5 minutes to have a read of that. I really want you to have a read of the attachment A, at least the first column, the minimum standards column of attachment A of DFAT policy, because it just really goes into detail about what the expectations are for our partners who receive our money, receive DFAT funding. And it's really useful, the attachment's really useful because if you do have questions about, well, how do I need to apply it, then you can look at the evidence that we look for when we do an audit, for example, and you can then be really clear about what our expectations are. I'll give you 5 minutes to look at that. If you've got ideas, you're most welcome to start writing them down and sending them in if you like. You don't have to, but it's great to see some coming through. Just one more minute and we'll come back and talk as a group. Great. Okay, well, we might come back as a group to talk about them. We've got some really good, some really great risks and possible mitigation strategies which we can go through. You're welcome to continue adding them if you wish. So Hannah initially talked about risk. Hannah and John, risk of abuse by staff to children in the shelter, and also risk of sexual abuse or exploitation of mothers and children in the accommodation. And the mitigation strategies talked about were adequate safe recruitment, staff training, and good complaints reporting mechanisms, which were really great ideas. Also talking about risk of abuse from residents to other residents, which is a big one as well. And we need to remember, I saw some statistics recently that 30% of the reports of sexual abuse, 30% of them were child on child as well. Sexual abuse, and that number's increasing quite rapidly. So that's something that we really have to be aware of as well in the work that we do, and not just think about abuse being perpetrated by adults as well. Let's talk about child labour as well, and having risk of child labour and mitigating that by staff signing the child protection policy and code of conduct as well, and here guidance on acceptable behaviour. Catherine talked about the risk that information is not kept secure, and perpetrators of family violence who are seeking shelter are able to be found, which is a real risk as well, and trauma relating to experience as well. So there's some really great examples here. I've done a couple myself here that I can show you as well. And which we talked about. We were talking about the two different types of abuse. This one's looking at abuse, for example, two different types of risk from personnel. And so this is looking at children may be abused by staff or volunteers, and mitigation measures can include applying our 9 minimum standards that are within the DFAT child protection policy, because that's a general requirement for to have a safe organisational system. And it's what's generally accepted as what's required for an organisation, and to ensure your personnel are as safe as possible. And that's all through there. But also on that can be things like also supervision, extra things. You know, our policy only looks at the very minimum, and it looks at the minimum. But for an activity like this, you would look into additional measures such as supervision, or also even situational issues like whether there's the way the doors and whether, you know, closed off spaces and things like that to address those as well. As someone's just said here, having 2 members of staff on to be on site at all times as well is a really great idea too. I had a look at also what about, and I think there was a bit of a mention here by one of the attendees as well, that the risk could be that the service doesn't address the specific needs of children and adolescents, and that could cause additional harm. For example, people in some respects may only be trained in providing counselling to adults, but are providing counselling to children and aren't trained in providing those sort of services to children, and that can be a risk. A control can be ensuring that training is provided to staff and volunteers on child-friendly psychological support methods, and just ensuring that children are included in decisions that will affect them as well. There was an example as well that before that specifically regarding a family violence program, where they were trying to find placements for a family, and it was agreed that they could go and live with their uncle. And so they were talking through this with the mother, and she was really happy with that approach, that she could go and live there and be safe until she finds something else. But then they asked the children about that, and one of the children just went, no, I can't go and stay with the uncle. I don't want to go and stay with the uncle. And they were able to tease that out a bit, and they found that actually that the uncle had previously been unsafe, had previously abused the child, and it wasn't unless they asked and included the children in that decision that they were able to find out about that. If they hadn't asked that child, they would have sent that child with her mother over to the uncle and put her into another unsafe place as well. So it's really important that we include children. Any questions on risk? I noticed that Angie mentioned needing a child-friendly complaint procedure. That's really important, especially in a place like a family violence or a shelter, for example. And some ideas are having, a child-friendly complaints box, for example, where they can write things and post them anonymously, for example, as well. But it's really important that they're aware of the complaints process, but also aware of the code of conduct. And so the behaviours that are expected of staff and of the other residents as well. Because if children are aware of the expectations of behaviour, then they're going to know if someone's not doing the right thing, and they're able to more likely able to realise that someone's not acting appropriately, and then more able to actually report that as well. And you're right, it's not just the staff that need to be trained, but also the residents and the children. So any questions before we go on to the next part? Okay, great. So these are we've shown you two documents that you can use that DFAT has available for your use that can hopefully help you not only assess the risk context, so the level of risk of your activity and organisations that you're funding, but then can also then have a look further into the actual program that you're running and having a bit of a look at the risks within those programs as well. So please use these documents, and you're most welcome. There's Word versions of them. You can use them and amend them appropriately to your organisation as well. We're quite happy to do that. And John just on the question, I will find that, because actually John's just asked about where I read the statistic about child-on-child reporting of abuse. I don't have it written here, and it was exactly a question that was asked in my training yesterday as well. So it's on my list to actually find that number for you, and I can find that out and get back to you, John. Yes, so I'll get a reference for that statistic. Okay, so we've talked a bit about applying DFAT's minimum standards at attachment A, which is your responsibility. You've hopefully had a chance to have a quick look at attachment A. Please, if you are having concerns, or if you have downstream partners who want to know what they need to do to comply, really, if they just have a good read of that, then it's a lot clearer for them as well. Also, at the end of this presentation, I do have a list of policy guide, child protection policy guides that can help you and your partners develop policies, and I can provide you with a copy of this presentation as well later today or tomorrow or something, well, whenever Beth can get it out, for you as well, so you won't have to write those down. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but we'll just look at one. The first minimum standard is that you need to have a child protection policy in place. Really important to know that it must apply to all staff and all your downstream personnel and partners as well. Okay, so if they are if they're performing any part of a DFAT funded activity, then they need to comply as well. And if you're getting audited, what they're looking for is that personnel are aware that it exists, and you've got some documented plan for managing your downstream partners and ensuring that they're complying or managing them. This might be a bit difficult to see, and again, you'll hopefully get if you get it sent, we get the presentation sent to you, you'll be able to have a look at it. But this is just a bit of an idea about, you know, when your downstream partners are expected to comply and what they're, you know, and what's expected of them. So you can have a bit of a read of that, but really, basically, it's just that all your downstream partners need to assess the level of contact and the level of risk and apply the child protection policy and then apply the minimum standards required to manage that risk. Downstream partners may sign on to their managing contractors policy, depending on the size and the risk profile, but you've got to note that if you do that, the managing contractor then takes responsibility for the actions of the downstream partner. So you're taking on a lot of risk if you allow your downstream partners to sign on to your policy. But you can do that if it's easier and if it's the only way that you can see it working. Sometimes that might work if you've just got like a couple of contractors or something like that and they don't have their own organisation. These are the other minimum standards. I'm only going to talk about one because I think in particular I have to have a quick talk about reporting. So recruitment and we'll just quickly talk about recruitment and screening just very quickly. So recruitment and screening has different requirements depending on whether the position is a contact with children position or a working with children position. But both of them require criminal record checks and also verbal referee checks. So that's requiring you to actually speak to the referees rather than just have written. That's because people are more likely to talk and provide you with more accurate information, and you're able to also ask specific questions about children as well. With reporting, even people with the best child protection policies in place, child abuse can still happen. And it's how your organisation responds is what's most important in these scenarios, both for the child and for the organisation as well. So that's what we're looking at when you report a child abuse or a child protection issue to us. We're looking at the way it's been responded to. I'm dealing with an incident at the moment where there are a number of separate allegations of grooming and sexual abuse within a school, and they also have an attached orphanage in place as well. So we don't fund the school directly, but we fund, they're a downstream partner of one of our partners, and they're very closely linked to our partner as well. The principal's the chair of the board. There's a really close link to that organisation. But the principal of the school is not taking the allegations. We just can't see that he's just not responding appropriately to them. He's not taking it seriously. He's not investigating it properly. The alleged perpetrators are still in the school. He's just moving them around. He's not actually investigating and finding out whether this is actually being done. It's actually being done. And so what's happened there is because of this, there's a lot of different donors involved, and so now the managing contractor who we provide funding to is getting funding pulled from them by a lot of other areas. So a lot of donors are actually going, you're not ensuring that your downstream partners are managing this properly, and you're not doing enough to ensure your downstream partners are managing this notification properly. So even though the notification is not within that organisation, because of the strong links between them and because they're not people aren't thinking they're putting enough pressure or doing enough, you've got donors pulling funding from that managing contractors organisation, and you've got donors also pulling money from the school as well, because it's a small town and people are finding out that this is happening, even though no matter how hard you try and keep these things confidential. So you're finding, and it's because of the inadequate response that's causing them to lose their funding. That's really important. Okay, does anyone have any questions specifically about any of the minimum standards or anything like that they want some clarification on? Okay, we'll carry on. So again, you're responsible for behaving appropriately. you've got a code of conduct. Attachment B of our child protection policy has the code of, I think it's now called professional behaviours, but the name, it means the same thing. So have a look at that. We'll talk about use of images in a moment, but if you have a quick look at attachment B, you can see what our minimum professional behaviours are. Depending on the level of risk and the activity that you're running, you may need to add to these. These are our minimum. We'd like you to have at least these minimum because they're there for a reason. But we like to see also that you've done a risk assessment of your activity and you've added anything in there that addresses, helps mitigate any of the risks to your specific activities. So if you've got a sports for development activity, you would certainly have additional behaviours in here that you would expect for your coaches, for example, or specific behaviours for volunteers or things like that. So you may need to, and you're not going to know that unless you do your risk assessment. So some of the main ones are to do not hit a child, avoid compromising situations where people may misconstrue your behaviour. Do not develop sexual relations with a child, and there's no excuse. The excuse that I thought that the child was 18 isn't enough, isn't good enough. It doesn't cut it. You have to, you've got to ensure that you don't. There's no way. You've got to be very certain you're going to develop sexual relations with a young person. Avoid being alone with a child, but again, these behaviours are not intended to interfere with normal family interactions. So it's only if we're not saying don't be alone with your own children or your children's friends and things like that. It's mostly just to ensure that we're just trying to ensure, this is a way of trying to ensure that you're picking up on any behaviour that may be considered maybe grooming behaviour. We can't be sure, but it's picking up on behaviour that's inappropriate, maybe inappropriate. Get consent, we'll talk about that for photos in a moment. Do not employ children in labour that's inappropriate given their age or developmental stage. They must have time for schooling and for play as well. And it must not be detrimental to their health. Use respectful language and always take action as well. You've also got mandatory reporting obligations. They're on page 7 of the Child Protection Policy to make it clear, but it's really any allegations or suspicions of child abuse or exploitation, and it's by anyone involved in DFAT-funded activities, any DFAT-funded staff, but it also goes down to actually any Australian citizen as well, permanent resident or Australian company, because we have extraterritorial laws in place that so we ask that you also report any Australian as well. And it includes policy non-compliance, code of conduct breaches, not as well. Who do you report to? We now have one spot now. This has changed in the new policy. You now report all child protection concerns to the Conduct and Ethics Unit, and they triage them. So if it's to do with a development organisation or a DFAT-funded partner, then they come to our Child Protection Compliance section and we help manage it. If it's to do with a staff member, Conduct and Ethics keep it. And if it's to do with an Australian, then it would go to transnational crime and the ACFID. So that's the way it works. Okay, any questions? I have a question here. I'll just have a read. Okay, so John's asking, when an incident is reported to you, critical or non-critical, how much should you follow up on how the situation unfolds? Is the initiative on you as a child safeguarding focal point? Someone in a position to offer advice to follow up on the case, or should it be the person who makes the report, a staff member who should provide you with follow-up details? So are you talking about, if you're talking about DFAT, is the initiative on you? Okay. So let me know, John, if I'm not answering the question that you're asking. But if your organisation becomes aware of a child protection notification, you need to report it to child welfare. They will let us know, and then we'll be in contact with you. And we don't actually do any of it. We don't actually go in and look. We don't actually go in and investigate. We just we'll provide you with advice if you need advice on investigations. But we'll be asking you, what are you doing about it? Is the child safe? What sort of investigation are you doing? Where's the alleged perpetrator? And we just ask you questions about how you're managing it. So we expect your organisation to manage it. And it's up to depending on your organisation's reporting processes, your organisation's reporting processes should have in place who you report to within your organisation and who within your organisation reports to DFAT. And then usually we work with the managing contractor and asking them how things are going. And the managing contractor can work with the downstream. Sometimes the managing contractor says just deal directly with the downstream partner. We can do that if that's what you prefer, but we usually work with the managing contractor who then, and we're getting information from them. And so we don't do the investigation, we just help, we provide information, and we're just ensuring that people are managing it appropriately as well. Does that answer your question? And yeah, sometimes you have a child protection focal point within your organisation, and they may be the people that you talk that DFAT, that us in the child protection compliance section will talk to, but that's a decision made within your organisation. By you mean the focal point of the organisation and the reporting procedures. Okay, let's have a look. Okay, I see what you're saying. So yes, I mean the question also is that it's not up to you as the focal point it's not up to you as the focal point to necessarily, if it's a serious allegation, for example, for you to investigate the situation. You need to make sure that people who are trained to investigate the situation, you need to make sure that people who are trained in asking children questions, for example, or investigating a serious child abuse allegation, people who are trained in it should be the ones that are actually doing the investigation. So you need to make sure you liaise with the local police if that's the right people to liaise with, or the local organisations who deal with that. Sometimes in some countries there's no organisation that will deal with that, and you need to do it within your own organisation, and that's something you just have to work out on a case-by-case basis, and we can provide advice on that as well. So it's really important you don't ask lots of questions of the child, for example, because you may impact on any investigation, and you can also re-harm the child through doing that. So it's really important that people who are trained well are doing that sort of information, getting that sort of information, and you're just asking only the only amount of questions that you need just to get enough information to pass it on to authorities. Okay, great. Any more questions? All right. So now we'll have our last section is use of children's images. This is often people are often confused or interested in this area as well, and that's unsure about their expectations here. So you have a look at the second part of the Code of Conduct in Attachment B. Looks at our DFAT's requirements for use of children's images. The big one that people get concerned about is consent. We don't want people to be afraid of taking photos of children because they're really important for organisations to show good development outcomes and things like that. So we don't want people to be scared. We want to be able to give them some pragmatic advice about that. So informed consent, by informed consent we mean that the child or parent needs to understand how the image is going to be used, as well as providing their consent as well. Consent doesn't have to be written, it can be verbal, or you can film it. It doesn't matter as long as you've got consent and you've documented it somewhere that you've got it as well. You can't ask a principal, for example, if you're going into a school, you can't say to the principal, can I get your consent to take photos of the children here? That's not okay, but you can ask them. You can ask the principal to get the consents for you. So you can say, we need to go into a school and take some photos of children. Could you please, we're going to take photos maybe of just one classroom. Can you please get the consents from their parents and let them know that we're going to be taking photos. Let them ask them if it's okay and how it's going to be, how the photos are going to be used. So you can ask a proxy, someone else, to go and get those consents for you. And then if they do that, then you just need to keep yourself a file note about how the consents were provided as well. And then you can ask the children at the time regarding their consent. We do, if it's a, and again, you can look at this take a risk lens, risk-based approach on this as well. The main thing is we want people to have an opportunity to tell you if they don't want their photo taken, because they may be, for example, not wanting to put their face out in the media for some reason. And we also need to make sure that children can't be identified, that they're not easily identified. They're your main risk. So if you've got a big community event, for example, where it's in the public domain, then you may need to have such stringent consents in place. For example, if it's like a public diplomacy event or a big sort of fun sporting event or something like that. Instead, you may be able to, if you can't possibly get consents of everybody involved, you could instead put up signs telling people that photos are going to be taken, or tell people over a loudspeaker that if there's any concerns, please come and see a certain person. But it depends on the risk. If it's a humanitarian crisis, you wouldn't do that. You'd do your best practice consents for that situation. We also talk about that images must be an honest representation of the context and facts. That children must be in a dignified and respectful manner and not vulnerable or submissive. So if we were looking at this, we would suggest that you use a different photo, because the child is quite vulnerable and obviously in a very vulnerable and submissive. File labels are important. This was a photo taken, put in the Canberra Times, and they were saying people are putting photos of endangered species on Facebook and leaving the GPS codes in the back, but also writing where they saw these animals. And poachers are then using this and going in and finding those animals and either finding the animals and poaching them or destroying their habitat. This can happen with children as well, so we have to be really careful we don't put the GPS codes in the back, and that we put as little identifying information as possible. So if you're taking photos of children in a small village that might only have 5 children in the village, for example, you may want to put the name of the province instead of the village, and just try and limit the amount of information you put in. Never put full names and things like that. And as I mentioned as well, it can be verbal. It doesn't have to be written consent. You can be verbal consent. You can just talk to people about just answering a question here which says, what if the parents are illiterate and cannot sign? You can just ask for verbal consent. And also context. This was a photo. Images must be honest representations. This was a photo taken by the Grey Man charity in a Thai-Myanmar border. They went into the village and asked if they could take photos of children so that they could get a school bus from the government. The next day, this picture was put up on their website. It didn't have the blacked out faces. This picture was put out on their website saying, we just saved this whole group of children from sexual exploitation. So they were using this, it was incorrect context. And the Thai authorities and the AFP were investigating, and everyone was very upset, obviously. So we need to make sure we use their honest representation. And this is just a picture of this. There's consent from this child, and shows that you can blur out a picture and get a good picture without having to get the consent of the whole. Okay, questions. Okay. Why are the school principals not considered as guardian when it comes to image consent? The reason is because in a lot of cases there's a power imbalance, I guess you could say, regarding the principal and donor. Sometimes the principal really wants to impress or do everything they can for the donor so they can get more money, and so they're not necessarily going to be ensuring that the best interests of the children are upheld in that situation. So they may not have the best interests of the child at the forefront. They might not realise that some people may have an issue with having their photo put up. Someone might be escaping family violence, for example, and the principal may not be aware of that. So that's the reason why we say no to that. Any other questions about photos or anything else? Again, this is what we can do to help in our section. We can have a look at policies as well. We've got a reduced number in the team at the moment, so we're not very quick with that at this point. It's something that we can do, and we are happy to do so. If you're wanting someone to have a look at yours or your downstream partners' policies, we can have a look at them as well. And these are our details. Again, I'll send this information to you so you don't have to write it down. And here's a bunch of how-to guides that can assist you with developing a child protection policy as well. And that's it. So if anyone's got any questions, I can hang around for a little while. Otherwise, thanks very much for your time, and happy to take questions offline in our child protection mailbox. Okay, so Jan's asking about informed consent. What about in the village context where people, there might be near a borehole or a new borehole? Often children and parents are not together. Can you accept older children's consent alone? That's a good question. In Australia, we accept the consent if someone's 15 years or older, then they're able to consent to their own medical decisions, for example. And so we do talk about if someone is 15 years or older, then perhaps you can decide if you can have a look at the risk and ask them, talk to them, ensure that they're aware of how you're going to use the photo and the impact of that possibly, and then perhaps that would be okay. That's something, but you just want to document that and say, look, we made a decision that they were over the age of 15 or 15 years and over, and this is what we explained to them, and we decided that they provided consent, and that would be enough. So yeah, that's you do have to manage the risk of the specific risk at the time, and depending on the activity. So if they were children who were children with HIV, for example, and they're in a group setting or something like that, then it's a much higher risk, and so you'd probably you would more likely go for the high level where you get parent and child consent. But if it's a general, that you don't see any other vulnerabilities, then I think it's okay for you to, it's probably okay for over 15s to give their own consent. But again, it's got to be risk-based. Got to think of the risks. I was asking if it's possible to ask children for verbal consent. Yes. As long it's verbal consent for parents and children, both is okay, as long as you document it and say that you got verbal consent. You just need to keep a file note or however it is that you document these things. And you can do it by film as well. People sometimes put it on their iPhones these days as well. Question is, are you able to provide a list of organisations that work in country dealing with child protection issues, so that our partners know who to refer abused children to? That could get quite I mean, we work in a lot of countries, so we don't actually have like a list on hand of organisations, but we do, if something comes up, so if a child protection incident or a notification comes up within a country and people aren't sure where to go, then that's when we engage we talk to Post, we talk to our partners on the ground and find out who the best people would be to deal with that. So we kind of do it on a case-by-case basis. Unfortunately, don't have anything specifically for every country at this point. Yes, you can accept a school teacher's verbal information that he or she has got the consent of his class, of his parents for photos. That's fine too. If they've got consents verbally or they've discussed it with their parents verbally. If the principal has told you that they have got the consent and you believe them, then you can just add that. That can be your consent. That's enough for DFAT. Yes, and that's for the principal. Or it'd be better if it was the principal, not just the class teacher. Yeah. Any more questions? Thanks very much, everyone.